Good day. Today is Friday, 4th July 2025, and today, after the various announcements about the cutbacks of American weapons supplies to Ukraine, we've had reports about another telephone conversation between the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Now, this conversation, which took place on the 3rd of July, happened 2 days after Vladimir Putin spoke to Emmanuel Macron, the President of France. And one has to ask whether perhaps that's just chance, whether perhaps Macron's job was to try to soften up Putin prior to Trump's call, or whether perhaps Trump called Putin because he felt that if Macron was calling Putin, then it was a good moment for him to call Putin as well. The more likely explanation for the call, however, is connected to the decision by the United States to stop supplies of certain key weapons, ammunition, and missiles to Ukraine. Now, in previous discussions, including a conversation which took place on the 18th of March, Putin and Trump discussed the American proposal for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Putin said that whilst he was not hostile to that proposal in principle, there were, as Putin called it, nuances. And one of those nuances, which he reiterated and made clear in many subsequent statements, and which have been repeated also in many further statements by other Russian officials. Anyway, Putin said that one of the key things was that Ukraine must not take advantage of any ceasefire to improve its military position, and he insisted that a ceasefire can only happen if the West, the collective West, stops military supplies to Ukraine in their entirety and ends intelligence sharing with Ukraine. When Putin said those things to Trump, both in a press conference and over the course of his telephone conversation with Trump, I pointed out that in effect Putin was politely rejecting Trump's proposal for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Well, what has now happened is that the United States has put on pause, perhaps indefinite pause, supply of critical weapons to Ukraine. Patriot missile interceptors, HIMARS missiles, certain types of anti-tank missiles, Stingers, manpads. And perhaps quite plausibly, Donald Trump felt that having taken that step, having suspended the supply of certain critical weapons to Ukraine, now might be the good moment to reopen the topic of a ceasefire. He could say to Putin, well, I haven't done all that you have asked. I haven't stopped all arms supplies to Ukraine. I haven't got the Europeans to agree to do the same thing. And it is inconceivable, by the way, that the Europeans would agree to do the same thing. But I have stopped supplies of certain crucial weapons. So are you perhaps prepared to revisit the topic of a ceasefire? Now, the short answer from Putin was no. I will now discuss this further by looking at the readout that the Russians have provided. The United States has not provided a readout of this call. The United States usually nowadays doesn't provide readouts of telephone calls between Putin and Trump. Instead, it provides, or rather Donald Trump himself provides, accounts of the call published on his Truth Social account. But Trump has not done so. In this case, instead, he's only briefly said that on the topic of Ukraine and the discussion which took place, he's very disappointed. But let's first of all go to what the Russians are saying, because it's very interesting, and it comes again not in the form of a conventional readout, but an account of the conversation from Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. And I will read the whole of it. Dear colleagues, another almost hour-long telephone conversation between President of Russia, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and President of the United States, Donald Trump, has just concluded. Donald Trump began the conversation by announcing that the U.S. Congress passed his administration's flagship bill envisaging reforms in taxation, immigration, and the energy sector. President Trump himself calls it the One Big Beautiful Bill. Vladimir Putin wished Donald Trump success in implementing the changes he envisioned and naturally offered greetings for Independence Day, the National Day of the United States, which will be celebrated today. And by the way, before I continue reading this readout, today is indeed the 4th of July, and may I take this opportunity to wish the best to all people in the United States on the celebration of this holiday, a holiday of independence from Britain, but also the day upon which the United States took the great step to establish the Republic, the American Republic, and eventually the Constitution, which established it in its, proper form, which I still myself consider to be one of the greatest events in modern history. But anyway, let's continue now with Putin's response and the Russian readout of the conversation between him and Trump. Ushakov then goes on to say this. At the same time, it was noted by our side that Russia had played a significant part in the establishment of the United States as a nation, including during the War of Independence, fought 250 years ago, and later during the Civil War, which ended 160 years ago. That both of those claims, by the way, are true. Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, was neutral during the American War of Independence, but clearly favorable to the Americans. And in the American Civil War, during the Civil War, the Russians at that time were outspokenly and strongly supportive of the government of the Union and provided not just diplomatic support, but a show of military force through the deployment of the Russian Navy in support of the Union during the American War of Independence. The American Civil War. Anyway, to continue again with Ushakov's commentary on the conversation between Putin and Trump. It was stated that our countries are bound not only by their alliance during World War I and II, but also by deeper historical ties. Very much Putin, the historian, again, deploying his prodigious knowledge of history over the course of a conversation with Trump. Anyway, it then continues. Incidentally, Putin mentioned that just before speaking with Trump, he had a conversation with representatives of Russia's business community. One of the ideas suggested during that meeting was holding an exchange of motion pictures promoting traditional values, which both we and the Trump administration hold dear. President Trump reacted immediately and said he liked this idea. There was a detailed discussion of the situation surrounding Iran and the state of affairs in the Middle East in general. The Russian side emphasized that it was crucial to settle any and all contentious issues, differences, and conflicts exclusively via political and diplomatic means. The two leaders agreed to maintain contact on the issue between the respective foreign services, defense ministries, and presidential aides. That is very similar to what Putin apparently said to Macron, and is consistent with the overall Russian position, that the Russians do not like military action against Iran. They strongly disapprove of it, but that they remain basically fundamentally opposed to Iran acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, and to the extent that they can, they're prepared to try to help along. Anyway, the commentary by Ushakov then continues. The latest developments in Syria were addressed as well. Similarly, the Russian and US sides intend to continue the dialogue on the matter. Interesting that this topic was brought up at all. The United States has just lifted sanctions on al-Jawlani's Syria, the Syria that is now led by al-Jawlani. Remarkably, the Russians still have all their bases in Syria, and apparently all the various sides, al-Jawlani himself, or President al-Shara, perhaps as I should call him, Israel, Turkey, and the various other factions in Syria, and apparently even the United States, for the moment, are all agreed on one thing, which is that the Russians should stay. They all want the Russians to stay for various, not always consistent reasons. But anyway, that's about the one thing that all of them do seem to be in agreement about. So up to now, we've had a friendly call, but notice the trace of nervousness about the way in which it is approached. I am assuming that Ushakov is going through these topics as Trump brought them up. I say that because it's obvious that it was Trump who initiated the call. So firstly, Trump informs Putin about the fact that he's got his big, beautiful bill through Congress, which is, of course, within the United States and in terms of Donald Trump's presidency, undoubtedly a significant political achievement. I mean, what its effects, its long-term effects will be on the US society and economy, that's a topic I'm not going to discuss in this program. But as a political success for Donald Trump, clearly it is a very big one. And he wanted to stress to Putin his success in all of that, though one wonders why he thinks that Putin would be interested. And then, of course, we've had discussions about Iran and discussions about Syria. Important topics. Iran is clearly a very important topic, but clearly peripheral topics between the United States and Russia. Putin comes up with congratulations for the 4th of July holiday. He suggests an exchange, a film festival of American and Russian films in the respective countries. Again, a curious and friendly, but frankly ephemeral point. And then eventually they finally get to the topic that is really important, which is the topic of Ukraine, which is clearly what the call was all about. Just as Macron used the crisis in the Middle East, the crisis between Israel and Iran, and the US and Iran as cover to call Putin, but it's clear that what he had was mostly Ukraine in mind. So I can't help but feel that Trump has done the same thing. He called Putin, told him about the big, beautiful bill. They had a long discussion, no doubt, about Iran. They talked a bit about Syria. The two topics, of course, are related, but all of this was to some extent intended, or at least was to some extent cover and intended to lead to the main topic, which was the issue of Ukraine. And this is what how Ushakov describes the conversation. Naturally, the issues surrounding Ukraine were also discussed. Donald Trump has once again raised the issue of ending the hostilities as soon as possible. So that seems to me like suggesting that Trump again asked Putin to agree to a ceasefire. And then we have the response. Vladimir Putin, that we still continue the search for a political, negotiated solution to the conflict. He informed his counterpart on the progress in implementing the humanitarian agreements reached during the second round of direct Russian-Ukrainian talks held in Istanbul. He also noted Russia was willing to pursue negotiations. Additionally, the president of Russia said that Russia would strive to achieve its goals, namely the elimination of the well-known root causes that led to the current state of affairs, the bitter confrontation that we are seeing now. Russia will not back down from these goals. Now, the words back down are very interesting, and they strike a note of defiance. And that does make me wonder whether Trump not only pushed very hard on the issue of a ceasefire, but might even have made certain threats. We'll come to that shortly. And then we have further comments. While exchanging views on bilateral matters, the two sides confirmed their mutual interest in implementing a number of promising projects in the economy, notably the energy sector and space exploration. Overall, I would like to point out that the conversation between the two presidents has, as always, shown that they are on the same page. It was candid, business-minded, and concrete. The two presidents will naturally continue communicating and will have another conversation soon. So according to Ushakov, it was overall a reasonably civil call, candid, business-minded, and concrete. They did discuss energy cooperation and space exploration together. They talked about those sort of things. We're not told in which part of the conversation they did that. But Trump asked for an unconditional ceasefire. The Americans again came back to the topic of the ceasefire, and Putin said no. And there clearly was some pressure because Putin said, we're not backing down. This remains our clear position. We've said it out many times. We are not backing down from this. And shortly after, we've had in Izvestia a interview, Russian newspaper Izvestia, with Rodion Miroshnik, a senior Russian diplomat. And Miroshnik, I think, set out the Russian position fairly clearly. Russia wants to see all Western arms deliveries to Ukraine halted. For now, the United States has suspended only part of its military assistance, specifically missiles and artillery shells, but even this may accelerate a resolution to the conflict. So Miroshnik said that the sooner Russia advocates the complete cessation of weapons supplies to Ukraine, the sooner this is accomplished, the sooner peace will come to Ukraine, and the sooner the fighting and bloodshed on Ukrainian territory will end. Nonetheless, the armed forces of Ukraine still hope for European assistance, and clearly the situation, therefore, with weapon supplies has not been resolved to the Russians' satisfaction. So Putin said no, and Trump was unhappy. And he's made that very clear. as I said, he didn't actually write a message on Truth Social. He said, "I'm very disappointed with the conversation I had today with Putin, President Putin, because I don't think he's there, and I'm very disappointed. I'm just saying I don't think he's looking to stop, and that's too bad." Now, that wasn't the only thing that Trump said about the call. In other comments, he seemed to be slightly softer. He did say that it was specifically on Ukraine, on the topic of Ukraine, that he was disappointed. He did confirm that they did discuss these other issues, like Iran, but nonetheless, he's used this expression, this term, "I was very disappointed with the conversation I had today with President Putin, because I don't think he's there, and I'm very disappointed. I don't think he's looking to stop, and that's too bad." So the question now is, what is Donald Trump going to do? Well, a few hours after we had the conversation, reports started to circulate in the media and were confirmed by Donald Trump that after the end of the 90-day period granted to various states to agree to tariffs, the United States is now sending out letters about higher tariffs against various countries, and these can range from 20% all the way up to 70% or so. I am reading. Russia up to now has not been subjected to any tariffs itself. So it may be that Trump is going to impose tariffs, or maybe he's going to impose further sanctions, or maybe he is going to return to the subtopic of the bone-crushing sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal have been talking about. The trouble with doing that, as I've discussed in many programs, is that the Chinese and probably other countries will not comply with those tariffs. That will then will not comply with those sanctions. They will continue to buy Russian oil despite being threatened with 500% tariffs if they do. The United States has just negotiated, according to Trump, a trade agreement with China, about which we have very, very few details. But it does seem that this was a priority for Trump. He wanted to get Chinese goods back onto the shelves of American stores. And besides, as I discussed yesterday, almost certainly he does not want further interruptions in the energy market, because if he does, that will lead to higher prices in the United States, which will affect his political position and popularity and authority in the United States. So I still think it's unlikely that he's really going to go down the route of Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill with its 500% tariffs. If he does, he's probably going to grant carve-outs to all kinds of countries, Turkey, India, perhaps even China, probably China, because I can't see realistically him doing anything else, in which case these tariffs and sanctions will become meaningless and they will have no practical effect. Notice that Trump recently excluded Iranian oil from sanctions, lifted sanctions on Chinese purchases of Iranian oil, which, given that China is the major buyer of Iranian oil, significantly weakens Donald Trump's sanctions on Iran. Now, the Chinese, incidentally, have been busy and they've been communicating their views, and they've done so in forthright terms, or at least they've done so according to an article that has appeared in the South China Morning Post. Now, I should explain that the South China Morning Post is a newspaper published in Hong Kong. It is in fact Hong Kong's newspaper of record. It is published in English, and most of the journalists who work for the South China Morning Post are, as it happens, Westerners. In most cases, the editors have also been Westerners as well. And it's not always had the easiest relationship with the authorities in Beijing. And I understand that its website, access to its website, is restricted on the Chinese mainland. So we're not talking here about an official Chinese newspaper. But nonetheless, it is a newspaper published out of China. Hong Kong is Chinese. And most people believe, I believe, that on Chinese matters, it is indeed very well informed. And the title of the article is China tells EU it does not want to see Russia lose its war in Ukraine. And it says that this is based on sources, and the sources appear to be European, by the way, rather than Chinese, judging from the article itself. And the article relates to a meeting between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang and Kaja Kallas, the High Representative of the EU on foreign policy, if one can say that. I mean, I don't think she does much in the way of foreign policy diplomacy. She does an awful lot in terms of very shrill advocacy. But anyway, I'm not going to waste more time discussing Kaja Kallas. Anyway, Wang Yi met Kaja Kallas, and apparently there were, well, it is in fact well established that there were a lot more officials, both from China and the EU, there. In fact, this is one of another of very regular meetings that takes place between China and the EU as these two major economic and trading blocs navigate their increasingly complex relationship. Anyway, the account in the South China Morning Post, which I'm not going to read, the South China Morning Post, by the way, has a very, very tough paywall, and I'm not going to go behind the paywall. But anyway, the article in the South China Morning Post gives an impression of an increasingly exasperated and angry Wang Yi. Wang Yi is one of the key diplomats of our present time. He has been running China's foreign policy for many years now. He is a consummate and unflappable diplomat in nearly every situation. And it takes a great deal, I think, to rile him. The one person who I would have thought would be almost guaranteed to do that at the present time is indeed Kaja Kallas. And one gets the sense that even the unflappable Wang Yi finally got impatient and frustrated with Kaja Kallas. Anyway, Kaja Kallas came along and told Wang Yi, as she always does, following on from what Annalena Baerbock used to do and other EU officials used to do, she badgered and insisted and demanded that China stop providing military and economic assistance to Russia, that China condemn the special military operation by Russia as a war of aggression, and demanded, and one senses that she did so in her usual exaggerated style, that China take a tough line against Russia to try to force Russia to stop the special military operation. And Wang Yi finally got angry, and he said that China is not assisting Russia to conduct the special military operation. It is not providing arms or weapons or intelligence or anything of that kind to Russia. In fact, he told Kaja Kallas and the other EU officials that if China were indeed providing that kind of assistance, the special military operation would by now be over. Probably true, by the way. But anyway, that is what Wang Yi said. And then he said something else. He said that China, anyway, has no interest and no desire to see Russia lose in Ukraine, because it knows perfectly well that if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, the United States will follow up by coming after China. So China and Russia hang together, and they need to support each other, and this is what China intends to do with Russia, including with Russia as it conducts the special military operation in Ukraine. And, well, this is one thing I will read from the article. This comment to the EU's Kaja Kallas would confirm what many in Brussels believe to be Beijing's position, but jars with China's public utterances. Some EU officials involved were surprised by the frankness of Wang's remarks. Well, they shouldn't be surprised. As I said, undoubtedly, Kallas provoked him. And as the article says, everybody knows that this is indeed China's long-term position and its long-term concern. It reads, the Chinese read all of the endless articles and position papers that pour out of the neocon think tanks in Washington and Brussels and London and Paris. They know perfectly well that the neocons have long had this long-term plan to try to isolate China by first of all defeating and then perhaps even breaking up Russia, and then, as they're now, some of them saying, breaking up Iran as well. And the Chinese know perfectly well that it is therefore in their interests that neither Russia nor Iran, but specifically not Russia in this particular case, should find itself in the position where it is defeated and faces the kind of outcome that the neocons want. So it's correct to say that this is not something that the Chinese talk much about. Chinese officials don't say this in public places. And the Chinese readout of this conversation between Kaja Kallas and Wang Yi contains none of this information. But there's no doubt in my mind that almost certainly Wang Yi did indeed say these things to Kaja Kallas, and that they do reflect China's policy positions, and that China will not impose secondary sanctions, or rather enforce Western secondary sanctions against Russia, will not stop buying Russian oil, which anyway benefits China's own economy, will not do, in other words, any of the things that the West insists that it do, and will certainly not impose the kind of pressure on Russia that people like Lindsey Graham and Kaja Kallas wanted to do. So, coming back to the conversation between Putin and Trump, Putin knows this, obviously. Trump presumably knows this too. I cannot imagine, given this Chinese stance, that Trump really does intend to go down the road of imposing 500% tariffs on China and threatening the Chinese with tariffs like that if they don't buy Russian oil. As I have said many times, the first law of diplomacy is not to bluff Beijing, because the bluff will always be called. And Donald Trump has already tried to bluff Beijing this year with his whatever it was, 240% tariffs, or whatever it was that they rose to. And he's had to scale this all the way back and reach some kind of trade agreement with China. And I don't think he wants to go down that whole route all over again. So Putin was speaking to Trump from a very, very strong position. As he knows, he's aware that American military supplies to Ukraine are starting to dwindle. He undoubtedly is familiar with the capacity limits that the Americans have now hit. He also knows very well that the military situation in Ukraine is developing increasingly favorably for Russia. And he knows that if he were to agree to a ceasefire, the only effect would be a frozen conflict in which Ukraine would eventually be rearmed, despite all the protestations and denials that he might have had from Donald Trump. The pause in military supplies to Ukraine that the United States has announced is specifically described as a pause. In other words, it's temporary. If the United States is able to resolve its problems with its lack of supplies, its lack of weapons, in conditions of a ceasefire, there is no reason to think that the arms to Ukraine would not resume from the United States. And of course, the Europeans are showing no sign or interest in joining in anyway. So Putin knows that he is in a strong position, and he knows that Trump is short of options and short of leverage, and so he said no. I suspect, as I said, that this was a difficult call. The words "Russia will not back down" in Ushakov's commentary effectively confirms that. I think the time has finally come for the Americans, for Donald Trump, to take no for an answer and to accept that there is not going to be a freeze of the conflict. There is not going to be a ceasefire. If they want to prevent a total debacle in Ukraine, then the best thing that they can do is to advise the Ukrainians to come to terms with the Russians based on the Russian memorandum, because the United States is short of weapons and the Russians are not going to stop. Now, Trump is speaking to Zelensky over the course of today, and I don't actually expect Donald Trump to give Zelensky that kind of advice. He would know in advance that Zelensky would reject it, and it would only result in another difficult call. And as night follows day, the European media and parts of the American media would then run with stories about how Trump was trying to bully Zelensky into doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. And Donald Trump has no need of articles and commentaries in the Western media that read like that. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to know what Trump and Zelensky say to each other. I suspect that Trump will try to calm Zelensky down, assure him that the United States is not abandoning Ukraine. It's not abandoning diplomacy in Ukraine. He's going to give reassurances to Zelensky that the arms stop that has just happened is temporary, and that as soon as things are sorted out, the United States will resume supplies of Patriot missiles and other things. And he will no doubt tell Zelensky that in spite of appearances, he is not being abandoned or betrayed, as Zelensky would say, by the United States. But coming back to my discussion in my video of yesterday, it is also the case, or so it seems to me, that however accommodating to Zelensky Donald Trump currently wants to be, the simple reality is that the United States cannot provide the weapons that Zelensky is most urgently demanding, the Patriot air defense missile interceptors, most of all, and the other weapons, because the critical state of American supplies simply does not allow for it. Now, I've been provided with some information about this. I've become a very fortunate person, I should say. The amount of information that I get from viewers today, from people who know things, is really extraordinary. I avoid, I should say, publishing information that I believe to be classified, especially because if I do, I think I'm going to put somebody, I worry that I might put somebody into trouble. And for the record, I don't think that I get much information that is classified. I did recently, by the way, and I made a decision for that reason to hold it back. But overall, the generosity in terms of information that I'm getting from members of the community really astonishes me. And, well, this person in particular has proved especially generous with the information he has provided. And this person has informed me that it isn't just a problem of missiles, Patriot missiles being in short supply, but in particular, some of the newer versions of the Patriots are also systems that the United States is nervous about supplying to Ukraine because of the properties of some of these missiles, which they don't want the Russians and, by extension, the Chinese to find out about. And I'm not going to describe the properties of these missiles. I'm not sure that this is classified information, by the way, but I'm not going to discuss it. But suffice to say that there are attempts being made to develop Patriot missiles that can deal with hypersonic weapons. And this is something that the United States really doesn't want to share with Ukraine. There's other problems as well. When it comes to 155 millimeter shells, it seems that the problem is not just that the United States is short of shells and that the Ukrainians have run through their stockpile of of shells that they've been supplied by Turkey through Syrian army stockpiles. It's also that the Russians have been hunting Western artillery systems supplied to Ukraine over the last 8 months. They've managed to destroy most of the artillery systems that the West supplied, the M777 howitzers and all of those. And there really isn't much point any longer anyway supplying shells, 155 millimeter shells, from the already dangerously depleted American arsenals, because there aren't the guns in Ukraine any longer to fire them. The guns that are firing in Ukraine are old Soviet-era guns that the Ukrainians have brought back into service, and they've been firing Syrian ammunition former Syrian ammunition, and that too now is in short supply. And I'm also told that when it comes to the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the United States thought that the time had come to apparently dispose of a large number of old Bradleys, and that was why Ukraine received quite a few of these. But now recent developments have made the Americans realize that they need these Bradleys for themselves after all. Anyway, the point I'm making is that it is simply not possible to conjure up weapons that aren't there or which cannot be supplied for all sorts of reasons of the sort that I have just discussed. This is something that some people find very, very difficult to accept. There's another article by Owen Matthews in the Daily Telegraph today, which is extremely bitter about Donald Trump's decision. It says that the United States, that Donald Trump is leaving Ukraine, hanging Ukraine out to dry, that without U.S. military aid, Ukraine's position is going to become extremely difficult, all of which is absolutely true. Owen Matthews, by the way, seems to walk back some of his earlier claims about how successful the Ukrainians are being in holding back the Russian offensive. I discussed all of that in a recent program. How he and others in the West were baffled at the fact that the Russians were still advancing despite all of the losses that they were supposedly suffering. This time, Owen Matthews admits that the Russians not only are advancing, but that they're winning, that they're actually winning the war. And he also acknowledges that this is going to continue and accelerate if Ukraine no longer gets the weapons from the United States that it has been getting up to now. Just saying. So, as I said, he's walked back a little of what he says, but he insists that the United States is able to supply weapons to Ukraine. He can't bring himself to acknowledge that there can be shortages and limits in American arsenals. He focuses on the relatively small number of weapons that were stopped in a single delivery from Poland. To be clear, that the figures of that delivery have been circulating a lot on the internet over the last couple of days, but it's clear to me that that is only one delivery out of several. And the point is that the number of some of the weapons in that package may not have been very high, Stingers and anti-tank missiles and things like that. But the point is that what the United States has just imposed is a stop on supply of all such weapons. And of course, an individual batch might be small, but it's encompassed within the bigger stop in supplies of weapons of that kind. But anyway, I don't want to follow up on that. Owen Matthews seems to find it very difficult to accept. In fact, he cannot accept that the United States simply cannot go on providing endless quantities of weapons to Ukraine. He is convinced that this is in some way a political decision. And his colleague on the Daily Telegraph, Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon, does the same. And he not only cannot accept that the United States has indeed hit its limits, but he's coming up again. He's resurrecting in rather dark language the theories about some kind of collusion between Russia and Donald Trump. Anyway, as I said, some people are in denial about this. I discussed this all yesterday in my program at considerable length. But that is the reality. Trump, over the course of his conversation with Zelensky today, cannot promise to Zelensky that which he doesn't have. Zelensky might say that he's prepared to buy Patriot missile interceptors from the United States, and perhaps, all other things being equal, Trump would be happy to sell them. But Trump cannot sell weapons that he doesn't have, or which perhaps he does have, but which he cannot sell for other reasons, because they're in short supply, because they're more needed in other places, because their physical and technological properties means that they cannot be compromised in the way that a sale to Ukraine might do. So there it is. It will probably be a somewhat uncomfortable conversation for Donald Trump. He was probably hoping, before he needed to speak to Zelensky, that he would be able to get Putin to bend and agree to some kind of a ceasefire. Putin has rejected that idea. So Trump is going to speak to Zelensky empty-handed. He can't help Zelensky anymore. He won't give Zelensky the sort of advice which I think he should. Zelensky wouldn't accept it anyway, and the Russians will continue to press on. I don't think Trump can give advice to Zelensky of the sort that I said. I think the Europeans can. But the Europeans, as I discussed in my program yesterday, won't. In fact, the Germans, according to reports, are in an absolute state about the American announcement. And this is completely unsurprising, by the way, given the extreme position that Friedrich Merz and his government have been taking on the topic of support for Ukraine. Anyway, there are reports in the German media that the German government is shocked and stunned by this decision, that they are feverishly trying to contact the Americans to find out whether this decision is for real and to see what can be done, if it is for real, to circumvent it. Apparently, the Germans also want to supply more missiles, air defense missiles, to Ukraine. They are running short of air defense missiles themselves, it must be said. They have, of course, their own production lines for certain types of air defense missiles, Iris-Ts, for example, but they are only being produced in small batches. They are still a very new and raw system, apparently, and they cannot replace the Patriots or hope to rival the mass production of missiles and drones that the Russians are doing. But there it is. The other European states, Britain, France, Italy, have been remarkably subdued about this American announcement, which leads me to think that they had already been informed about it in advance. I am going to suggest that this is the last serious attempt by the United States, by the Trump administration, not just to obtain a ceasefire in Ukraine and to freeze the conflict, not just to try to keep the Kellogg plan alive, but to try to influence the future of events in Ukraine altogether. From this moment on, the Russians will not just be in the driving seat, but they will be able to drive forward, in effect, increasingly unimpeded. The United States is not in a position to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons. It knows that Ukraine is losing the war. Its various diplomatic initiatives have run into the sand. It can't get the Russians to agree to a freeze of the conflict. It can't persuade Zelensky to make the kind of concessions to the Russians that might end the conflict. And the option of the bone-crushing sanctions that Lindsey Graham is talking about is so counterproductive that I think, in effect, it has been ruled out. On that topic, by the way, just to say that Politico is saying that Steve Witkoff is actually advising Trump and is arguing within the administration that far from imposing more sanctions on Russia of the kind that Lindsey Graham is advocating, sanctions intended to restrict Russia's energy exports, the wiser thing for the United States to do would be to lift all energy-related sanctions against Russia in order to, in effect, reduce energy costs in the United States. I think Trump himself, in his calmer moments, might be attracted to that idea, but I don't think that the United States is ready to do that at this time. But anyway, Politico says that Witkoff at least is arguing for it. So there we are. Probably, as I said, the last meaningful attempt by the United States to try to shape the situation in Ukraine. So what is happening, in fact, in Ukraine? Well, last night, again, the Russians hammered Kiev. Over 500 drones, apparently, attacking targets in Kiev over the course of the night. An inundation of missiles, Iskander-Ms, other types of Iskander missiles, apparently Kinzhals as well, all of them hitting targets in Kiev. The Zhulaini air base, where the Patriot missiles are located, particularly heavily hit, and lots of photos and films of big fires there, but fires and smoke all over Kiev. Immense damage now being done to the various military and industrial facilities around the city, and we'll have to wait for the next couple of hours for the Russian Defense Ministry to provide us with an update as to what they think, or rather what they intended to attack and destroy, and what their assessment is. Anyway, a massive attack by the Russians, and these are becoming now routine. We see that the Russians seem to have unlimited numbers of drones now, and the Ukrainian air defenses already becoming inundated by this flood of drones and missiles coming from Russia, are now finding it impossible to cope. I would add, by the way, that if the Russians start using their air force again, over the last year, the Russians have been launching fewer Kh-101 cruise missiles at Ukraine from their strategic bombers, probably because the Kh-101 and the Calibre are the two cruise missiles that the Ukrainians have been most successful in intercepting. But if the Russians start to launch more of these again from their bombers, because production apparently of these cruise missiles continues and has even increased, and also because the shortage of Ukrainian air defense missiles means that more of these subsonic cruise missiles will get through, then the effect on Ukraine is going to be devastating. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, if the shortage of air defense missiles, including, by the way, of Stinger missiles, means that the Russian Air Force is now able to roam further and deeper inside Ukraine, dropping its devastating fab bombs, then the crisis for Ukraine is going to get worse still. So anyway, a massive drone and missile attack on Kiev, happening on a day, by the way, when Zelensky himself was not even in Kiev. He was again in Denmark. He was in Denmark, away from Kiev. He was meeting his friends in Europe, desperately trying to get more money, trying to get more support. He needs, according to Martin Sandbu in the Financial Times, 150 billion euros a year to keep Ukraine running. Astonishing figures. And he's, as I said, going cap in hand around Europe again, meeting with his friends, his European friends. He feels safe and secure amongst them. Anything he can do rather than remain in Kiev as the Russian missiles fall and as the Russian drones hit and as he gets telephone calls from Donald Trump. Anyway, that's Zelensky and that's the missile strikes. The Russians elsewhere are continuing with their various advances. They apparently have now advanced into Kharkiv region from another place. They've crossed the border and captured some more villages in Kharkiv. The Russians continue to claim that this is all part of setting up some 20-kilometer buffer zone for Belgorod region. This buffer zone is getting bigger all the time, and I can't help but think that before long it's going to extend to the city of Kharkiv itself once the Russians feel themselves in a position to advance upon it. There's also been many more reports now coming from the area of Konstantinovka. The main focus this time has been the fighting around Chasiv Yar. I mentioned yesterday that the Russians, having secured Chasiv Yar itself, the central area of Chasiv Yar, are now clearing up the micro-districts, the residential micro-districts that ring Chasiv Yar, as they ring many Soviet towns and cities. Apparently, there's only one block, one micro-district left. I have miscounted, by the way, the number of micro-districts. They turned out to be more than I expected or believed there were. But anyway, we're now down to one remaining block of one micro-district. It's assumed that within a few days, all of the micro-districts and the entirety of Chasiv Yar or its metropolitan area will indeed be under Russian control. The Russians will command the heights above Konstantinovka. Their artillery will be able to take advantage of that. That will put the Ukrainian defenders in Konstantinovka into a very precarious position, and will also put the Ukrainians in Kramatorsk, which Russian artillery based in Chasiv Yar can apparently also overlook, also in a difficult position. But perhaps the most dramatic news continues to come from the northeast of Pokrovsk, where the Russian breakthrough continues. In fact, the Russians are now so far north of Pokrovsk that it's becoming almost as if they're advancing further. Their focus is more to advance northwards rather than to encircle Pokrovsk itself. Though I have no doubt that eventually the purpose of this will be to create a ring around Pokrovsk. I assume that they're simply gaining territory in order to thicken out the ring that they are creating. But anyway, the Russians are advancing, and my sense here is that the opposition, the Ukrainian opposition, is very weak. And there continue to be claims that there are Russian troops fighting in Novo-Ekonomichny itself. I don't know whether that is true, but it wouldn't surprise me. And one can see that the ring around Pokrovsk is closing fast. And perhaps the fastest area of all of Russian advance continues to be western Donbass, towards the Dnieper River. With every day that passes, the Russians advance faster and further in this area. They're edging closer and closer towards Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, and the river from the east. And again, I get the sense that Ukrainian resistance here is starting to break down and is becoming more fragmented and weaker. I read a commentary on one of the Russian telegram channels. It was probably Slavyangrad, which said that at the rate things were going, the Russians might finally be achieving big arrow advances, 70 kilometers a day advances, presumably in this very same area by August, September. Well, we shall see. Anyway, that's the military situation. And this, of course, all happening in the immediate aftermath of the American aid cutoff, which inevitably is going to have an impact on the developments on the battlefields fairly soon. Now, in several earlier programs, including some I did back in 2022, I discussed the famous exchange between Field Marshal Rundstedt, the commander of the German army in Normandy after the Allied invasion, and General Jodl of the German leader's personal headquarters. And over the course of that conversation, Jodl is supposed to have asked Rundstedt, what in this desperate situation can we do? And Rundstedt is supposed to have replied, make peace, you idiot. What else can you do? At least the German words are slightly different, but that was basically the meaning. Now, in the scenario that we are looking at now, isn't that the approach the Ukrainians and their European allies ought to be taking? Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do? The Americans are starting to walk away. The Chinese have told the Europeans, we want the Russians to win. The Russians are winning. The European military industries are fragmented. We are today here in London in the continuing aftermath of the extraordinary crisis, budgetary crisis, that has hit Britain, with much talk now that Prime Minister Starmer is on borrowed time. I've said many times that sooner or later the Zelensky curse would come for him. And well, we can see now that it is indeed stalking him, and there's no obvious sign that he's going to be able to escape it. Isn't this the moment when European leaders should be making peace? Seems not. The British obviously far too absorbed in their own domestic problems now. There's universal admission. If you go to the media today, there is universal admission right across Britain, right across the political spectrum in Britain, left, right, supporters of the government, opponents of the government, that the economic situation in Britain is in crisis, that the country is massively indebted, that it cannot keep control of its costs. there's a long article in the New Statesman that talks about the need to increase taxes and is advocating for increases in the standard rate of income tax. It also speaks of the fear of the government at doing this, the constant worry about higher energy costs. Never any explanation, by the way, as to why the energy costs are so high and why the situation with energy supply is so unstable. Never talk about the economic war with Russia. This entire long article in the New Statesman looking at the gravity of the situation in Britain. In many ways, it's a good article. Gravity of the situation in Britain never mentions anywhere the conflict in Ukraine, the role it might have in it, the cost of this war, the price of the higher energy costs that it has resulted in. Don't talk about that. But anyway, Britain is in incredibly deep crisis. You'd have thought that a government that really has concerns, both for its own future and for the country's future, and understanding the realities of what are now is happening in Ukraine. And I cannot believe that the British government isn't aware now of the gathering momentum behind the Russian offensive and isn't aware of the decisions and the policies being followed in Beijing and Washington. Anyway, one would have thought that they would, at this precise time, be taking steps to make things at least a little easier for themselves by cutting back on aid for Ukraine, by joining Macron in calling the Russians, by looking for ways to get out of this impossible commitment to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, a preposterous proposal that nobody, I think, seriously believes can ever be achieved. Well, you will go through the newspapers, you will go through the magazines, you will listen to the television commentaries, you will listen to what the ministers in Parliament and elsewhere are saying. You listen to what the Prime Minister and his Chancellor are saying. You will listen to the opposition leaders. And they will never, ever talk about this thing. And in Germany, it's even worse. Because the Germans, they also can see what's going on in Ukraine. They also obviously know what the Chinese are saying and what the Americans are saying. And they also know what the Chinese and the Americans are doing. And they too realize, obviously, that turning back the Russians and holding the Russians back in Ukraine is now impossible. You would have thought that, again, a German government conscious about the enormous process of deindustrialization and economic crisis which is starting to overwhelm Germany would want to do something about it. It says that it's worried about the rise of the AfD and Die Linke and perhaps before long the BSW. Again, you would think that they too would now be engaging in some kind of outreach to Moscow to see what can be done in this situation, if not to save Ukraine, and perhaps there should be some thought about doing something to save Ukraine, but also to try to secure a long-term peace in Europe, which would at least provide time and space for the Europeans, for Germany, to try to get on top of its massive problems. But no, they're busy phoning up the Americans to find out whether these recent American decisions are for real, whether they might be reversed in some way, whether they can provide more funding and more money, both not just to Zelensky now, but apparently to Trump, to try to persuade him to sell arms to Germany so that it can sell them to Ukraine. All these far-fetched, absurd schemes. Truly, the leaders of Europe are fools, idiots, as Rundstedt supposedly said. Well, there it is. I don't think any of this is going to change. I think that in several months' time, the Russians will be on the Dnieper. I was looking at a map of the situation in Zaporozhye now. It seems to me that it all ultimately depends, Zaporozhye's future ultimately depends on control of three places. Kamyanska, village to the south or town to the south of Zaporozhye. The Russians now virtually control it, putting them within artillery range apparently of Zaporozhye itself. Orechov, a little bit further to the east from Kamyanska, and the Russians are now very close to Orechov. And Novomykolaivka, a small town which the Russians are now approaching from the east. The Russians gain control of all three of these towns. Then you can count the weeks and months before the battle for Zaporozhye itself begins. And with the Russians probably able to cut communications from the north and across the Dnieper, contrary to what many believe, I don't think the Ukrainians will be able to defend Zaporozhye itself for very long. But there it is. That's the pace of events. That's the direction events are taking us. There's no ability in Europe to think this out or think this through. We are, if not idiots, certainly the rabbits caught in the headlights of the oncoming locomotive juggernaut, because that's what the Russian army has now become. And there's nothing, it seems, that our leaders can do. Well, this finishes my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Remember that you can buy all sorts of amazing things in our shop, including our new series with the names of various cities and capitals. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.